The night was unnaturally silent as Daniel approached the decaying remains of the old glass factory. The air itself felt wrong, thick and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to his tongue. Moonlight barely seeped through the jagged openings in the factory's roof, casting eerie, fragmented shadows across the crumbling walls. The building loomed before him, its broken windows jagged like rows of serrated teeth. Daniel hesitated, feeling a chill creep up his spine as he stepped over the threshold, his flashlight flickering briefly, as if reluctant to illuminate the void ahead. Inside, the factory was a mausoleum of silence, broken only by the crunch of shattered glass beneath his boots. The shards seemed to glint unnaturally, their edges glowing faintly as if charged with an invisible energy. A soft hum began to resonate in the distance, low, droning, and alive. Daniel froze, his pulse quickening as he strained his ears. The sound was almost imperceptible at first, like the murmurs of a distant crowd, but it grew louder with each step he took. The further Daniel ventured, the more the factory seemed to breathe around him. Machinery long rusted and abandoned seemed impossibly intact, their metal surfaces unnaturally polished. His flashlight beam danced across conveyor belts frozen in time, still littered with half-formed glass sculptures. A sudden, sharp clinking noise echoed from the far end of the room, as if a piece of glass had fallen. Yet, as he turned toward the source, there was nothing but the oppressive darkness staring back at him. A peculiar smell hung in the air, burnt silica mixed with the acrid stench of something older, decayed. As Daniel moved deeper into the factory, he began to notice faint handprints on the dusty machinery. They were small, like those of children, yet smeared and distorted as though made in desperation. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail, unable to stop himself. The factory seemed to pull him further, the hum growing louder, almost melodic, as if calling to him. He approached the center of the main production hall, where a massive furnace loomed. Though it had not been operational for decades, the faint red glow of embers pulsed faintly within it. The hum turned into whispers, disjointed, unintelligible voices that seemed to overlap, their tones urgent and accusing. Daniel's breath hitched as he realized the whispers weren't coming from the furnace, but from the shards of glass scattered around him. The shards reflected something strange, fragments of faces, disembodied and anguished, mouths open in silent screams. They flickered in and out of view as his flashlight passed over them, each face staring directly at him before vanishing. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he stepped back, but his retreat was halted by a sudden metallic clang. Behind him, a piece of machinery sputtered to life. The grinding of gears filled the room, deafening and out of place in the otherwise dead space. Daniel turned sharply, his flashlight trembling in his grip, as a conveyor belt began to move, dragging unfinished glass sculptures toward the glowing furnace. He could swear he heard faint voices arguing, the words indistinct but filled with panic. As the whispers intensified, Daniel felt an almost magnetic pull toward the furnace. The air around him seemed to vibrate, making it hard to breathe. Then, without warning, a loud, piercing sound shattered the tension. A single pane of glass, suspended in mid-air, cracked violently and fell to the ground. The shards skittered unnaturally, forming a jagged line leading deeper into the factory. Daniel's instincts screamed for him to leave, but his feet betrayed him. The trail of shards glittered like a beacon, guiding him toward the unknown. As he took his first reluctant step, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. It was the kind of silence that suffocated, thick and alive, pressing down on him as he ventured further into the abyss. The factory seemed to close in around him, its secrets waiting, hungry for him to discover them. Daniel's hesitant steps carried him into a dimly lit corridor lined with rusting lockers and shattered panes of glass. The smell of decay was stronger here, a mix of burnt wood and something faintly sweet like rotting fruit. His flashlight flickered again, but this time it wasn't just the unreliable battery. He swore he saw a faint glimmer, a reflection in the glass fragments scattered on the floor, just for a moment, but it was there. A figure, a shadow that wasn't his own. His pulse raced, but curiosity pulled him forward, deeper into the heart of the abandoned factory. In the corner of a room, half buried beneath debris, Daniel spotted a stack of faded photographs. Carefully, he lifted one, brushing off the thick layer of soot and ash that had settled over the years. The image showed a group of workers standing proudly beside a massive glass-blowing machine. They all wore thick goggles and stained aprons. At first glance, they appeared unremarkable, just laborers frozen in time. But as Daniel studied the photo more closely, his stomach churned. One of the figures, a man standing at the edge of the group, had no face. His features were eerily smudged, as though something had erased him from existence. Daniel flipped through the remaining photos. The same faceless man appeared again and again, always at the edges of the group, sometimes in the background, lurking like a forgotten specter. His unease grew heavier with each image, and a strange, icy sensation crept up his arms, as though unseen fingers were brushing against his skin. Then he found the final photograph, and his breath caught in his throat. It was his grandfather, clear as day, standing among the workers, a young man with an easy smile and eyes that mirrored Daniel's own. But unlike the other photos, this one had been defaced. Long, jagged scratches marred the image, cutting through his grandfather's face and chest. The scratches weren't random. They were deliberate, almost feral, as though made in a fit of rage or desperation. And beneath the photo, scrawled in thick black ink, were the words, "He didn't belong." The whispers started again, faint at first but unmistakable. They came from all around him, echoing off the walls and mingling with the metallic groans of the building. This time, Daniel could make out fragments of sentences. He saw too much. Shouldn't have touched it. The glass remembers. His flashlight beam trembled as he scanned the room, but he was alone. Or so it seemed. A metallic thud rang out, startling him. He spun toward the sound, and his flashlight illuminated an old workbench at the far end of the room. On it lay a single object, a glass figurine, impossibly pristine amidst the surrounding decay. The figurine was shaped like a man, bent over as if burdened by an invisible weight. As Daniel stepped closer, he noticed something even more unsettling. It wasn't just a figurine. It was a perfect likeness of his grandfather, down to the smallest detail. When he reached for it, his fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of the glass, and a shock coursed through him, not physical but emotional. In an instant, memories that weren't his own flooded his mind. A factory alive with sound and motion, his grandfather working late into the night, and the anguished screams of men trapped as glass shattered around them. The image of the faceless man returned, looming over the scene like a shadow of death. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, warning him to leave, to run. But Daniel couldn't move. The figurine was impossibly heavy in his hands, as though it carried the weight of the entire factory's past. His eyes darted to a nearby mirror, cracked and tarnished, but still functional enough to reflect his pale face. Behind him, however, stood the figure of a man, his features blurred, his presence suffocating. Daniel whipped around, but the room was empty. Only the figurine remained, gleaming with an unnatural light, its surface warm to the touch. The words "he didn't belong" echoed in his mind as he clutched the glass effigy, his breath shallow and his heart pounding. Somewhere deeper in the factory, a loud crash reverberated, as if something, or someone, was moving toward him. He stumbled back into the hallway, his grip tightening on the figurine. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His grandfather's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was tied to this place, to whatever dark force had claimed the lives of so many before him. And now it was reaching for him too. The past wasn't just forgotten. It was waiting, watching, and pulling him closer to the truth. Or to his doom. Daniel's breathing was shallow as he stumbled into another room, his flashlight beam trembling against the rotting walls. The figurine in his hand felt heavier with every passing moment, as if it were anchoring him to the factory's cursed history. The whispers had subsided, but an oppressive silence filled the space, thick and suffocating, pressing against his ears. He tried to convince himself to leave, to drop the figurine and run, but the strange pull of the place was undeniable, like invisible hands guiding him towards something he didn't want to see. The room he entered was different from the others. The walls were lined with shattered mirrors, their fragments still hanging by stubborn threads of rusted metal. Each shard reflected Daniel's image back to him, but they were distorted, stretched, broken, twisted into versions of himself that he didn't recognize. The mirrors weren't just reflecting him, they were showing pieces of something deeper, something buried. One shard displayed his face as a child, another showed him as an old man with hollow, sunken eyes. And in the largest shard, directly ahead, he saw himself standing beside his grandfather. But his grandfather's face was obscured, replaced by a smudged void. A sudden, deep groan echoed through the room, and Daniel froze. The mirrors began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. Slowly, the largest mirror darkened, revealing an image of the furnace room he had passed earlier. The furnace was blazing now, roaring with an unnatural flame that seemed almost alive, twisting and writhing like a beast trying to escape its cage. The whispering voices returned, louder and more urgent. "Choose," they hissed. "Free us or stay." A sharp clang made Daniel jump. and he turned to see the door slam shut behind him. A new figure appeared in the reflection of the largest mirror, standing beside the furnace. It was a man, or at least the shape of one, cloaked in shadows that writhed like smoke. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers, and its hand extended toward him, pointing to the figurine he clutched. The whispers rose into a cacophony, overlapping and chaotic. They seemed to pour from the mirrors themselves, each shard amplifying the sound until it became unbearable. "Destroy it," the voices pleaded. "Set us free." But another voice cut through the noise, deep and commanding, resonating from the shadows in the mirror. "No," it boomed. "Keep it. Leave now, and it will leave you be." Daniel was paralyzed, caught between the conflicting demands. He looked down at the figurine, its surface gleaming in the fractured light. He could feel something inside it, a presence, faint but undeniable. The figurine pulsed faintly, growing warmer, as if it were alive. The whispers continued to plead, but the shadowed figure's voice remained steady. "If you destroy it, you will share their fate," it warned. "Their screams will become yours." The mirrors around him began to fracture further, cracking loudly, sending shards raining to the floor. Each falling piece reflected a new horror. Ghostly faces screaming in agony, clawed hands scratching at invisible barriers, and the faint image of his grandfather, reaching toward him with empty, hollow eyes. Daniel's mind raced, his body trembling as the weight of the decision bore down on him. If he destroyed the figurine, he might free the souls trapped within the factory. But at what cost? Would he lose himself in the process, becoming another victim of the cursed place? But if he kept it intact, would the horrors of the factory continue, claiming more lives in an endless cycle? The shadowed figure stepped closer in the mirror, its form growing larger, more defined. "You've already seen too much," it whispered now, its voice like gravel grinding against metal. "The choice isn't theirs. It's yours. Will you sacrifice yourself or someone else?" The figurine began to shake violently in his hand, emitting a faint, haunting cry. Daniel's heart pounded as he gripped it tighter, feeling the presence inside struggle against his touch. His thoughts spiraled, memories flashing before his eyes. His grandfather's laughter, the warmth of childhood, and the cold, empty space his disappearance had left behind. He screamed, the sound ripping from his throat, as the room itself seemed to collapse around him. The mirrors shattered in unison, the shards floating momentarily before crashing to the ground like broken stars. The furnace in the mirror flared brightly one last time before fading into darkness. Daniel stood there, breathless, clutching the figurine. The room was silent again, but the choice still loomed. His hand hovered over the edge of a nearby table, ready to smash the figurine against it. The weight of countless souls bore down on him, their fate intertwined with his own. Whatever he chose, there would be no going back. The silence was deafening as Daniel stood in the shattered remains of the mirror room, clutching the figurine that now seemed to throb faintly in his hand, almost like a heartbeat. The air grew colder, biting at his skin and making his breath visible in the dim light of his flickering flashlight. The factory wasn't just still, it was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. But he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the oppressive weight of an unseen presence pressing down on him. Then it began. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in a distant breeze, but unmistakable. Whispers. They crept out of the darkness, soft and scattered, as though spoken by a crowd standing just beyond the edge of his perception. The voices overlapped, some pleading, others mocking, their tones shifting unpredictably. Daniel turned slowly, his flashlight scanning the room, but nothing moved. The sound wasn't coming from the walls or the air. It was emanating from the shards of glass scattered across the floor, each one vibrating faintly as if alive. He crouched down, his flashlight catching the fractured reflections in the shards. They didn't show his face. Instead, they revealed fleeting images of others, men and women with hollow, anguished eyes, their mouths moving in silent screams. The whispers grew louder, words beginning to take shape. "Help us," one voice pleaded. "You can't leave," another hissed. "You belong here," a third whispered, its tone dripping with malice. The room began to warp. Shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, crawling along the walls like living things. Daniel's flashlight flickered violently, casting fleeting glimpses of figures in the darkness, distorted shapes with elongated limbs and blank, featureless faces. Every time the light blinked out and returned, the figures were closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and guttural, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The glass remembers," it growled, the words vibrating through Daniel's chest. The figurine in his hand pulsed more violently now, growing hot to the touch. He wanted to drop it, to run, but his fingers wouldn't obey. It was as if the figurine had fused with him, an extension of his body he couldn't escape. The shadows began to close in, converging toward him like a tide of living darkness. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his grasp and spinning across the floor. The beam landed on a far wall, illuminating a single shard of glass that had remained intact. In its reflection, he saw himself, but it wasn't him. The reflection stared back with cold, dead eyes, its mouth curling into a grin that didn't belong to him. A sudden, piercing sound tore through the room, like the shattering of 1,000 panes of glass at once. Daniel clutched his ears, dropping to his knees as the sound reverberated through his skull. The figurine fell from his hand, clattering to the floor but miraculously remaining intact. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed even more unnatural. Daniel opened his eyes, his vision blurred and his head pounding. The room was different now. The mirrors were gone, replaced by walls covered in shimmering glass panes, each one reflecting a different version of himself. In one, he was young and carefree, laughing in a moment he couldn't remember. In another, he was older, his face gaunt and haunted. But the reflection directly ahead was the most chilling. It showed him standing in the factory, his body twisted and deformed, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The shadows began to move again, but this time they didn't stay at the edges. They surged forward, surrounding him, enveloping him in darkness so complete that it felt like drowning. And then the voice returned, soft and intimate, whispering directly into his ear. "You're part of this now," it said, the words dripping with finality. Daniel gasped as he felt something cold and sharp brush against his back, then his arms, then his face. It was as if invisible hands were caressing him, their touch leaving trails of ice across his skin. He tried to move, to scream, but his body refused to obey. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, filling his mind with a chorus of voices that didn't belong to him. And then, in the darkness, he saw it, the furnace room. It was no longer a memory or a reflection. It was real, the roaring flames casting long, flickering shadows across the factory floor. The shadowy figure stood beside it, waiting, its ember-like eyes fixed on him. The figurine was in its hand now, glowing faintly, as if it had absorbed something from him. Daniel's body finally moved, but not by his will. He felt himself being pulled toward the furnace, his feet dragging across the shattered glass. The whispers grew louder, their words blending into a single, deafening command. "Choose." Terror gripped him as the flames roared higher, their heat searing his skin even from a distance. The shadow reached out to him, its hand impossibly long, its fingers curling like claws. Daniel knew in that moment that whatever choice he made, it wouldn't matter. The factory had him now, and it wasn't letting go. Daniel staggered into yet another corridor, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The air around him was stifling, dense with an almost tactile darkness that pressed against his skin. His flashlight sputtered weakly, barely illuminating the hallway ahead, where rusted machinery loomed like ancient, forgotten sentinels. The figurine, now pulsating faintly with a dull red glow, seemed to grow heavier in his hand, as if it carried the weight of every soul the factory had consumed. The whispers had returned, but this time they weren't faint or scattered. They were clear, intrusive, worming their way into his thoughts like parasites. "You'll never escape," they taunted, their tones dripping with cruel certainty. "You're one of us now." Each word twisted deeper into his mind, amplifying the suffocating fear that gripped him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if the shadows creeping along the walls were real or a figment of his unraveling sanity. As he stumbled forward, the corridor seemed to stretch unnaturally, warping like a reflection in broken glass. The walls shimmered with faint, distorted images, ghostly echoes of the factory's past. He saw workers toiling at machines, their faces gaunt and weary, their hands moving in mechanical repetition. But then the images shifted. The workers began to slow, their movements growing sluggish as if time itself had turned against them. Their faces twisted in agony, their mouths opening in silent screams as their bodies contorted unnaturally, merging with the machines they once operated. Daniel tried to tear his eyes away, but the visions consumed him. The shadows on the walls stretched and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to mock his every step. His flashlight flickered again, casting fleeting glimpses of figures lurking just beyond the edge of its beam. Faces half-formed, eyes glinting like shards of broken glass. He felt their gaze burning into him, each glance a needle piercing his resolve. And then the voices began to shift. No longer taunting, they became seductive, almost soothing, like a lullaby sung in a language he didn't understand. "Why fight it?" they cooed. "It's easier if you let go." The words wrapped around him like tendrils, pulling him deeper into the factory's embrace. The figurine grew warmer in his hand, its glow intensifying as if responding to the voices. He felt a strange compulsion to hold it closer, to press it against his chest, as if it could shield him from the horrors around him. But the temptation was laced with dread. Each step he took felt heavier, as if the floor itself was trying to pull him down into its depths. The shards of glass scattered along the ground began to shift, sliding across the floor like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They formed jagged shapes that spelled out words, their meaning clawing at the edges of his mind. "Fear is the key." Daniel's breathing quickened as the words pulsed beneath him, their edges glinting like knives in the faint light. The temptation to give in, to let the fear consume him, was almost overwhelming. He could feel it gnawing at his mind, whispering promises of release, of escape from the unrelenting nightmare. All he had to do was surrender, to let the factory claim him as it had claimed so many others. Suddenly the corridor narrowed, the walls closing in around him, their surfaces now glistening with something wet and organic. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their seductive tones twisting into a chorus of demands. "Let us in," they hissed. "Feel the fear. Become one with it." Daniel dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voices drilled into his skull. The figurine slipped from his grasp, landing on the ground with a soft clink. He stared at it, its glow now pulsating in rhythm with his own racing heartbeat. The shadows around him thickened, coiling like serpents, their forms undulating with a life of their own. One shadow reached out, its clawed hand stretching toward the figurine. "No!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking as he reached for the object. But as his fingers brushed its surface, the ground beneath him trembled violently. The walls groaned, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the corridor, as if the factory itself was roaring in anger. The shadows recoiled momentarily, but the temptation lingered. The voices returned, softer now, but no less insidious. "Why resist?" they whispered. "You belong to us. The fear will set you free." Daniel clutched the figurine tightly, his mind a battlefield of terror and defiance. He could feel the weight of every decision he had made pulling him closer to the edge of despair. The factory wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it wanted him. The fear it fed him wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, calculated, designed to break him piece by piece. And yet, a small spark of resistance remained. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that giving in would mean losing everything, his sanity, his identity, and whatever shred of hope still lingered in the oppressive darkness. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him, and took a shaky step forward. The shadows hissed in frustration, their shapes writhing angrily as they retreated into the walls. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, but he kept moving, clutching the figurine like a lifeline. The whispers followed him, their promises and threats blending into a haunting symphony that echoed in his mind. As he pressed on, Daniel realized the truth. The fear wasn't just a weapon, it was the factory's lifeblood, the force that kept it alive. And it was hungry. The corridor eventually gave way to a massive chamber, its scale dwarfing everything Daniel had encountered so far. The walls were lined with enormous, broken panes of glass, each reflecting warped and twisted versions of himself. Some images showed him cowering, others screaming, and in one, he was staring blankly, his eyes lifeless and hollow. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an unsettling hum that resonated in his chest, vibrating his bones. At the center of the room stood the furnace. It was colossal, an ancient beast of machinery, its surface blackened by years of fire and decay. Yet, against all logic, it was alive. Flames roared within, their colors unnatural, sickly greens and deep, pulsing reds that seemed to move with intent. The heat it emitted was suffocating, yet Daniel couldn't bring himself to turn away. It was as if the furnace was staring back at him, an unblinking eye that saw everything he was, every fear he tried to bury. Clutching the figurine tightly, Daniel took a step closer. The ground beneath him was slick with something thick and dark, a liquid that reflected the furnace's fire like pools of molten glass. He didn't want to look down, but his eyes betrayed him. The liquid wasn't just reflecting light, it was showing faces. Dozens of them, all twisted in anguish, mouths agape in eternal screams. Some he recognized as workers from the photographs he had found, but others were strangers, their features distorted by pain and terror. And then he saw it. Among the faces was his grandfather. The image sent a cold shock through Daniel's veins. His grandfather's face was not screaming like the others. Instead, it was staring directly at him, its expression a mixture of pleading and warning. "Daniel," a voice boomed, deep and guttural, shaking the very air around him. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice came from the furnace itself, its flames flickering in time with the words. "You've come far. Too far to turn back now." The room darkened, the flames dimming until the only light came from the faint, pulsing glow of the figurine in Daniel's hand. The furnace roared again, its voice taking on a sinister edge. "The truth is here. The choice is yours. But every choice has a price." The air around Daniel seemed to solidify, pressing against him like an invisible cage. The weight of the figurine grew unbearable, pulling at his arm as if it wanted to leap from his grasp and into the furnace. He struggled to hold on, but the temptation to let go whispered in his mind, soothing yet filled with dread. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming shapes that slithered and writhed, their movements unnatural and wrong. From the darkness, the figure emerged, the shadowy man he had seen in the reflections. It was taller now, its form more defined but still shrouded in an impenetrable haze. Its eyes glowed like molten embers, fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made his knees buckle. The shadow extended a long, clawed hand toward him, gesturing to the furnace. "It's time," it said, its voice a chilling echo. "Free them, or join them." Daniel's mind raced. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, each voice vying for his attention. "Destroy it," one screamed. "Don't let it take you," another pleaded. But among the cacophony, a softer voice emerged, the voice of his grandfather. "Daniel," it said, calm yet filled with sorrow, "you have to choose. But you must understand, not everything can be saved." Tears stung Daniel's eyes as he looked at the figurine. It was glowing brightly now, almost blinding, and he could feel the presence within it, dozens, maybe hundreds of souls, trapped and screaming silently. They pressed against the surface, their shapes warping the glass, pleading for release. But release came with a cost. Daniel knew that if he smashed the figurine, the souls would be freed, but so would the darkness that bound them. The factory would feed on him instead, claiming him as its next prisoner. If he kept the figurine intact, the souls would remain trapped, their torment eternal, but he might be able to escape. The shadow loomed closer, its hand outstretched. "The fear will guide you," it whispered. "Choose." Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped toward the furnace. The heat was unbearable now, searing his skin, but he couldn't stop. He looked down at the figurine, its light pulsating like a heartbeat, and then at the shadow, which watched him with cold anticipation. Tears streaming down his face, Daniel raised the figurine above his head. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the voices begging, screaming, demanding. The furnace roared, its flames surging, and the shadow's hand reached closer, as if to claim him. In that moment, Daniel made his choice. And as the figurine left his grasp, the factory seemed to hold its breath, the world poised on the edge of oblivion. The figurine fell from Daniel's hands, spiraling downward in what felt like slow motion. The factory seemed to react instantly, the air thickening as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The moment it struck the ground, the sound of shattering glass erupted, impossibly loud, reverberating through the chamber like a violent scream. The shards didn't scatter, they hovered, suspended in midair, glowing with an eerie red light. The furnace roared to life, its flames surging higher, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like phantoms set free. Daniel staggered back, shielding his eyes as the room filled with an otherworldly glow. From the shards of the figurine, shapes began to emerge, twisted and fragmented, yet undeniably human. They were the souls of the trapped workers, their translucent forms flickering like dying embers. Their faces were contorted with pain, their mouths moving silently as if screaming, though no sound escaped. They swirled around Daniel, their expressions shifting between gratitude and anguish, before turning their attention to the furnace. The shadowed figure stepped forward, no longer obscured by the darkness. Its form was monstrous now, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its face a swirling void of smoke and embers. It let out a guttural roar, shaking the very foundations of the factory. "You dare defy me?" it bellowed, its voice a mixture of rage and disbelief. The souls began to converge, forming a cyclone of light and shadow that whipped around the furnace. Their glow intensified, clashing with the dark energy emanating from the shadow. The chamber grew unbearably hot, the heat pressing against Daniel's skin like needles. He fell to his knees, watching in helpless horror as the battle between light and darkness unfolded before him. The shadow lunged at the cyclone, its claws slashing through the air, but the souls retaliated, their collective light burning it back. Each time the shadow recoiled, it let out an unearthly shriek, its form flickering as if threatening to dissolve. Yet, it fought on, its rage fueling its relentless assault. Amidst the chaos, Daniel noticed something horrifying. The furnace was changing. The flames within were no longer just fire. They were alive, writhing and twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces emerged from the inferno, screaming silently, their expressions filled with torment. The furnace was consuming the souls even as they fought to escape, feeding on their energy to sustain itself. Daniel realized the truth. The furnace wasn't just a machine. It was the heart of the factory, a malevolent entity that thrived on the fear and suffering of those it claimed. And now it was growing stronger, its flames threatening to engulf everything. The shadow turned its attention to Daniel, its ember-like eyes locking onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "This is your doing," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You freed them, but you cannot save them. Their pain is eternal, and now, so is yours." The room began to collapse, the walls groaning and splintering as the factory seemed to tear itself apart. The shards of glass that had once hovered in the air now rained down, slicing through the cyclone of souls and scattering their light. The furnace roared louder, its flames surging outward, consuming everything in their path. Daniel's mind raced. He knew he couldn't fight the furnace or the shadow, it was too powerful. But he couldn't stand by and let the souls be devoured again. Desperation gave him clarity, and his eyes fell on a lever near the furnace, rusted and ancient. It was labeled emergency shutdown. Summoning every ounce of courage, Daniel lunged toward the lever. The heat was unbearable, searing his skin as he stumbled across the room. The shadow roared in fury, its form dissolving and reforming as it lunged after him. "You cannot stop this," it bellowed, its voice shaking the ground. The souls, as if sensing Daniel's intent, surged toward the shadow, their light burning brighter than ever. They swirled around it, binding its limbs and dragging it back, their collective strength holding it at bay. The shadow screamed in rage, thrashing violently, but the souls didn't relent. Daniel reached the lever, his hands trembling as he gripped it. It was stuck, rusted in place, but he pulled with all his might, his muscles straining as the heat and pressure bore down on him. The shadow's voice grew louder, screaming threats and promises of pain, but he ignored it, focusing only on the lever. With a final, desperate heave, the lever gave way. The furnace let out an earth-shattering roar, its flames erupting in a blinding explosion of light. The force threw Daniel backward, slamming him against the wall. When he opened his eyes, the room was silent. The furnace was dark, its flames extinguished, and the shadow was gone. The souls hovered briefly, their forms now calm and serene. One by one, they faded into the air, their light dimming until only darkness remained. Daniel lay on the floor, his body battered and burned, but alive. The factory was crumbling around him, its walls collapsing as the malevolent force that had sustained it was finally destroyed. Summoning the last of his strength, he dragged himself toward the exit, the sound of falling debris echoing behind him. As he stumbled out into the night, the factory collapsed completely, the ground swallowing its remains. Daniel stood in the silence, the cool night air washing over him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity he could breathe. But as he looked back at the ruins, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a shard of glass, untouched by the destruction, reflecting his own face. Only it wasn't him. The reflection stared back, its eyes glowing faintly, and its mouth curled into a sinister grin before vanishing into the darkness. Daniel stood in the desolate clearing where the factory had once loomed, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The ruins lay still, a smoldering mass of twisted metal and shattered glass, but the silence felt unnatural. The faint light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale, lifeless hues across the debris. Yet, even as the morning arrived, the weight of the night lingered. He wanted to believe it was over, that he had ended the nightmare, but deep inside, a shadow of unease refused to leave him. As Daniel turned to leave, his foot nudged something small and sharp in the dirt. He looked down to see a shard of glass glinting in the faint light. Picking it up, he noticed it was unnaturally pristine, untouched by the heat of the destruction. Its surface was smooth and cold, but as he held it up to the light, a chill ran down his spine. The shard wasn't reflecting his face. It showed the twisted, burning figure of the shadow from the factory, its ember-like eyes glowing faintly, as if watching him from a prison just beneath the surface. Startled, Daniel dropped the shard, his heart racing. It landed silently on the ground, but even from a distance, he could see the faint glow pulsing from within it, like a heartbeat. He stepped back, his instincts screaming for him to run, but something rooted him to the spot. The shard wasn't just glass, it was alive, a remnant of the malevolence he thought he had destroyed. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Daniel froze, his ears straining to make out the words, but they were fragmented, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. He could only catch pieces. It's not over. You can't escape. The glass remembers. Each phrase sent a shiver through him, the voices eerily similar to those he had heard inside the factory. Desperate to leave, Daniel stumbled toward his car, parked just beyond the tree-line. The quiet countryside that had once felt tranquil now seemed oppressive, every shadow hiding something unseen. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat. But it was empty. The drive home was uneventful, but the silence was maddening. The hum of the tires on the road, the occasional rustle of leaves outside, it all felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When he finally reached his apartment, the sun was fully risen, but its light brought no comfort. Shadows clung to the corners of his vision, and every reflective surface seemed to glint unnaturally. Inside, Daniel locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, his body trembling. He closed his eyes, willing the images of the factory, the shadow, and the screaming souls to fade. But when he opened them, he saw the shard of glass sitting on his coffee table. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't brought it with him, he was sure of that. And yet, there it was, its faint glow pulsing softly as if mocking him. He reached out with a trembling hand, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, the whispers returned, louder this time. "Welcome home," they hissed, their tones dripping with malice. Daniel recoiled, his pulse pounding in his ears. The lights in the room flickered, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. Shadows began to creep along the walls, their shapes twisting into unnatural forms. The shard seemed to vibrate, its glow intensifying until it filled the room with an otherworldly light. And then the reflections began to change. The television screen, the glass of a framed photo, even the surface of his coffee table, they all showed the same image. The factory, standing intact, its furnace roaring with unnatural flames. Figures moved within the reflections, their forms distorted and flickering like an old, damaged film reel. At the center of it all was the shadow. Its ember-like eyes locked onto Daniel through the glass, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You freed them," it said, its voice echoing in Daniel's mind. "But not me. You brought me with you." Daniel stumbled back, his mind reeling as the reflections began to ripple, their surfaces cracking like thin ice. He grabbed the shard, intending to hurl it across the room, but the moment he lifted it, he felt its weight pulling at him, dragging him toward the reflections. The walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by endless corridors of glass. Each pane reflected not just Daniel, but countless versions of him, some screaming, others standing silently, their eyes glowing faintly just like the shadows. He was trapped, caught between worlds, unable to distinguish reality from the horrors unfolding around him. The whispers grew louder, building into a deafening roar as the shadow stepped closer, its form breaking through the glass. It towered over him, its presence suffocating. "You thought you could leave it behind," it said, its voice dripping with cruel amusement. But the glass never forgets. With a final, blinding flash, the reflections shattered, and Daniel was left standing alone in his apartment. The shard was gone, and the room was silent once more. But something had changed. Every reflective surface around him, the mirrors, the windows, even the screen of his phone, now showed faint, flickering shadows, as if the factory's presence had followed him into his world. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. He knew deep down that the factory wasn't destroyed. It had simply shifted, embedding itself into his reality, its reach extending beyond its crumbled walls. And as the sun set that evening, the shadows in his apartment began to move.